It gives us great pleasure to present our recording of the book launch for Engaging with Environmental Education through the Language Arts that took place on Friday the 25th of April 2025, digitally from the University of York Department of Education.
We hope you find the recording interesting and exciting. And if any of the ideas described in the book launch interest and engage you, please feel free to contact us both at our York email addresses shown on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've had a talk by Anna Mary. We're now moving into the Meet the Authors section of the digital book launch. And I'm going to ask Nick now to come in and talk to us about section 1 of the book.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. I hope everybody can hear me. Can I add my thanks and welcome to everybody? It's particularly good to see contributors for the first time whom I've worked with for over a year. How nice to see you in person. We thought it might be useful just to say a few words about the rationale behind the structure of the book. So for the 3 sections, I'm going to say a little bit and introduce that section. The first section, you can see from the title, opening up the debate, but we wanted to set some markers down at the start for some key themes and issues which then emerge throughout the book itself. Chapter 1 opens with a chapter from Sasha Matthewman, and we were very pleased to have a chapter from Sasha, not only because it's now 1 o'clock in the morning where she is, but Sasha's book, Teaching Secondary English as if the Planet Matters, which came out in 2010, was inspirational for both myself and Amanda in helping to change our thinking about how we work with literary texts in the classroom from an ecological perspective. And we really wanted to get a sense of what Sasha's thinking was now, 15 years after that book. So we wanted to open the book with a chapter from her. And this is the first now of 2 chapters in the book. Anna Mary talked about the international scope of the book. This is the first of 2 chapters from Aotearoa, New Zealand. The second chapter is from Claire Echterling, who unfortunately can't be with us today. So I'm going to say a few words about her chapter when the time comes. Third chapter is from our colleague Martin Braund. We were very anxious to break unhelpful binaries between humanities on the one side and science on the other. And we were delighted that Martin felt he could contribute a chapter because for us, he bridges that gap. He's not only an international expert in science, but also an international drama practitioner. And so we're very pleased to have a chapter from him as our 3rd marker chapter in the book. And then the 4th chapter in this section is from Professor Uwe Küchler at Tübingen University, who again is an acknowledged expert in teaching English as an additional language. And we wanted to include within the umbrella of the language arts for this book something from our colleagues who work with English as an additional language. So we're looking forward to a chapter from him. Also, I should say at this point that the points that Claire makes in her chapter, which I'll talk to in a minute, are somewhat different from the points, say, that Professor Küchler, his position on certain issues. So it'll be interesting to see how themes unfold, and hopefully in the breakout group we can continue those interesting discussions. Okay, so that's enough from me. So hopefully now over to Sasha.
Thanks, Nick. So, Sasha, when you're ready, do you want to give us your piece, your 2 minutes?
Delighted. Kia ora koutou. And it's lovely to be here. So when Amanda asked me to write a chapter about texts that speak strongly to the environment, my first thought was of Australian poet Les Murray and his unusual power to influence my students' writing. Take Sophie's Weta poem. Now, you won't know about a weta, but a weta is a huge insect native to New Zealand. And despite its ecological significance, you're unlikely to find it written about in a book of poetry. But student poems about the weta, the nautilus, and the blue bottle jellyfish were prompted by reading Les Murray's poem Shellback Tick and other poems from his luminous translations of the natural world. Students went beyond the typical charismatic creatures, tiger, tiger, shining bright, as subject, and shared a range of ecological research in the process of creating their classroom anthology of native fauna and flora. And by the end, they knew that New Zealand nature is more than a lot of birds that can't fly. But what about prose? Would students read the nature canon, texts by Thoreau or Richard Mabey? Maybe, probably not. Students tend to read for plot action, relationships, and affirmation of identity, and texts cannot speak if no one is listening. So why restrict yourselves to texts that explicitly speak about the environment? Eco-critics have shown us that all texts have something to say about the environment, even if they're not about the environment. It's how you read them that matters, taking into account past, present, and future contexts and noticing their environmental attitudes. Which is why in my chapter I wanted to emphasise the centrality of how you read texts and the body of theoretical and practical work done by eco-critics in literary studies. Much of my work has been about how principles of reading texts eco-critically can be adapted to classroom contexts as shared and mediated activity. 5 years teaching in a Waldorf Steiner school has influenced my response to the spiritual presence of the natural world. We have here an unusual emphasis on the shared recitation of verse in all sorts of contexts. It's a practice worth reviving more widely. For texts to speak on a soul level, they need to be regularly recited as sustaining sources of hope. This is our daily morning verse. I look into the world wherein there shines the sun, wherein there gleam the stars, wherein there lie the stones. The plants, they live and grow. The beasts, they feel and live. And I to spirit give a dwelling in my soul. So I'd like to end there on that idea of reverence and hope for the natural world.
Thank you, Sasha. That was really moving, actually. It was lovely to hear that poem at the end. And I absolutely agree with you about the need for sources of hope and for things to speak to the soul. So, Nick, you're Claire for 2 minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Sasha, for that. Yeah, I was going to speak to Claire Echterling's chapter, which, as I said, was our second chapter in the opening section of the book. Claire was at Caldwell University in New Jersey when she was writing this. You can see the title there, Fostering Environmental Justice, Climate Justice and Collective Action Through Children's and Young Adults Literature. What Claire is particularly interested in is intersectionality, and particularly the links between environmental issues and social justice. And you'll find in the book that this is a theme that runs through many of the chapters that are to follow. That first bullet point is her point about she's concerned that the kind of children's books she's seeing in America at the moment tend to oversimplify and depoliticize environmental issues, by which she means there's too much focus on individual responses to the environment. So she says, for example, we might have a meatless Monday in school and think, oh, well, we've done our bit for the environment. And to think like that, useful though it might be, is to avoid the political dimensions and the power structures which underpin the environmental crisis and social issues. She argues that problems can't be solved through market forces and technology. And she says that alongside individual action, we've got to have green governance, democratic collective action, policy and legislation. We wanted to place Claire's chapter second in the book for a number of reasons. First of all, she opens up a key debate, and Sasha has kind of touched on this recently with her mention of hope in that moving poem she shared with us. The debate about how we are to work on environmental issues with the young people we teach. And my colleague Zoltan Varga, I'm glad to say, is at the meeting. He and I have been talking about the role of feelings in education. And he asked a very pertinent question, I think, where he said, what kind of emotions are we trying to evoke in our students when we're working with them on these kind of issues? What kind of emotions? Is it hope? Is it despair? What are we doing? Claire posits the question, are young people citizens in training? Are they learning to become citizens? Or are they actually agentive citizens themselves at the moment? How do we position them like that? And she would say, yes, they are active citizens. And she points to the youth movements around the world, the movements of young people who are vitally concerned now with climate justice and change. This is an important issue, as I just mentioned, that I know that Professor Kuchler has thought deeply about as well, and perhaps will mention in his presentation. The second reason we wanted to put Claire's chapter in this position in the book is that she really helps us to set the scene by offering a really helpful review of what she calls a new wave of eco-literature, designed for young people of all ages, from the youngest to the oldest, and which address the concerns she raises. And if I were a classroom practitioner wondering what text to use with my students in the classroom, I would find Claire's review of what is currently out there, and there's some wonderful material that we can use. I would find that review immensely helpful, particularly the work she cites from the whole world, including Brazil, Uganda, and Russia. So that was a chapter that I learned a lot from reading, and it contains a wealth of information for us to explore. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Nick. That was beautifully summarised and really helpful. So we'll move on now to Martin.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, everybody. Well, when I first got this invitation from Nick, I must admit I was a bit reticent, really. And I suddenly thought, well, it's quite a long time since I was engaged with environmental education. And I thought, I don't know what language arts are. And so I started delving around into the literature and I started thinking about some of the things I've written before. And then it came to me that language is about how humans communicate, really, at the end of the day. And that's much wider than just speaking and writing. And one of the authors I read about, and it's quite a recent paper in environmental education research listed all the experiences of how the arts have been used in environmental education. It's quite a list, really. Creative writing, dance, drama, drawings, fabric, films, models, music, painting, photo photography, poetry, sculptures, videos, ephemeral art, which is the art made from things in the environment. It goes on, the list. I mean there's almost nothing that isn't included, and that's about communication. So I felt a bit more relieved about that, really, because I've worked a lot with drama in environmental education, but I haven't really worked so much with the others. Well, a little bit with fine art and drawing, I suppose. And then I realized that, delving back into my own experience, I do know something about environmental science and environmental education because I taught it for 8 years at a place called Bretton Hall College, which was a college of the University of Leeds, but it was also one of the UK's leading art colleges. So I actually had the job of trying to persuade people who were engaged in fine art, drama, sculpture and so on to get involved with science. And it was quite a hard job, really, in some ways, because they had various experiences of being taught science in their past, not all of which were positive. And so this became a bit of a critical autoethnography, my chapter, really, underpinned by the literature. And I thought, well, I'm not sure whether this has worked very well, but Nick said he thought it worked okay. So he wasn't too critical of me. Well, not too much anyway. So I thought, well, that's all right, then I'll carry on. And a major theme in my chapter is to show that actually the arts can humanize environmental education, even more so for the whole sciences. And by that, I mean that science has kind of evolved this quite obstructive and remote language to a lot of young people. I mean, we use all sorts of symbols, equations, mathematical notations, symbolic representations, and so on. And so the languages of science are often gatekeepers, which block many young people from getting to grips with science. And that's really important for eco-literacy. And Wittgenstein called this understanding the rules of the game. So you've got to actually get into the game to know how to get into it. And I want to dispel that kind of notion by looking at how language arts can do that. So in the chapter, I take time to reflect on how I taught environmental education, reviewing what I think is quite an uneasy history, really, from romanticism through functionality to aestheticism. And I'd spend some time looking at earth education because that's where I was really in Bretton Hall. And I sometimes dwell on that, maybe a bit too much, I don't know. But it certainly positively impacted my teaching. But I'm also critical of the fact that that can end up in a kind of wasteful lament for the way in which that was involved and a lack of focus on personal environmental actions towards sustainable lifestyle choices. So I critique that to a certain extent. And thinking further about this, I wrote about imagination and beauty being connecting rings between the arts and the sciences. And I also wrote about the virtues of being reflective and still in a landscape, just listening and looking more closely. And I used Bourdieu's idea of capital, arts and science capital, to wonder if arts capital is more readily available to youth today. It's embedded in the culture, you know, in music and in youth culture and in youth literature and visual imagery and so on. And I wonder whether drawing on arts capital is actually a way of addressing the lack of first-hand environmental experiences that a lot of young people have and the degradation of the planet, and to tackle what young people often find a bit over-facing in terms of we talk about eco-crisis, and so I think a lot of young people just throw their arms in the air and go, oh, I don't know what I can do about that. It's just too big a concept for me to get into. So I look at how the language arts might help to address that. So thanks for inviting me, Nick. And, you know, I got over the initial reticence and you weren't too hard on me. So that was great.
Thank you, Martin. That was a lovely kind of personal feel to your talk. And already, I think, coming through the different author discussions, there are so many similarities cropping up. So we're going to move on now to Professor Uwe Büchler.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm so excited to be here, and I really look forward to this day and this event here because I really wanted to meet all these people, some of which I know, some of whom I haven't heard of, but certainly I was also influenced early on from Sasha Matthewman's writing. So the problem for me was, or the way I tried to conceptualize the topic, you can actually flip to the next, yes, exactly. Flip to the next page. The way I try to conceptualize is that on the one hand, I was very interested in the topic, but I was also shocked a bit by teachers and learners, students, pupils at schools that were, well, let's say a bit annoyed, if not bored, by the topic of the environment, now also in English. After they had seemingly learned everything there is to learn about it in biology and geography and social studies, and now English comes along. So my question is, what other perspective do I have to offer? And the field that I'm working in, TESOL or TFL in Germany, is literally called foreign language education. So I think actually the foreignness is the one concept that sticks out and that can be understood in a strictly positive way, because the unfamiliarity of the other language, of a new or an additional language, the unfamiliarity of the words, of the English language, of the background, the cultural background that is encoded into the language, seems to open up fresh space, a fresh perspective that lies very much in the comparison between the native language that my students or my pupils would grow up with and English as an intercultural dialogue in the most positive sense. So therefore, I do believe, and I just finished a manuscript, a book manuscript actually, on the fact or on the argument that foreign language education does have a crucial role to play in environmental education. This unfamiliar space or this fresh perspective provides learners with an additional conceptual framework. And because this is such an international crowd, I'm sure you immediately know what I'm talking about, right? Other words are not just other words, but actually they are other concepts that stick behind those words. Simple example would be breakfast, right? I don't know what you had for breakfast this morning, but certainly everybody knows that the full English is very different from the continental variety, let alone from the Swabian Frühstück that I may have had. But of course, it expands a lot further also into the sciences. What do we call things and why do we call things this way? This intercultural dialogue that comes from the otherness, from the foreignness, from the unfamiliarity of the language and cultures, then goes on to influence all sorts of concepts. What do we consider food and what do we consider nature in the first place? For Britons, it may be a different kind of landscape they have in mind than for the Germans who think of the forest all the time, apparently. So environmental issues, I would argue, are not just a nice add-on. They are not just like any other topic that you could discuss in the foreign language, but environmental issues actually align quite neatly and beautifully with the goals and purposes of what language education or foreign language pedagogy are supposed to do. The one contrast maybe that Nick was alluding to earlier with regards to the activism or the political impact is actually not in contradiction to my work at all, except that in Germany, teachers must not be, they are not allowed to indoctrinate their students. And of course, nobody would want to do that, but there is a slight danger that taking action or educating for action, for action or for activism could lead away from the goals of foreign language education. And I'm reasserting that actually, no, it does not necessarily, unless it's one-sided, but it can be nicely aligned. As much as I embrace, and therefore I'm also very grateful for the perspective of Martin Brand earlier, as much as I am embracing scientific knowledge, and I'm grateful for the scientific foundation, say, of the climate debate, I'm also quite conscious that at least in German education, and I studied a couple of school books over several decades, several generations of school books, the texts that are used for the environment are often scientific texts. They often confront the students with knowledge that they actually either already have from the general public, from the newspaper clippings, for example, that are used for school books, or they reiterate what the other subjects do. That's why I find it very important to find an angle to look at the environment from a strictly humanist perspective. And I think actually also that is not in contradiction, but actually a reinforcement of what Martin Brand has said earlier. Finding examples, finding perspectives that underscore, if you will, the strengths of the humanities. That is my goal. And actually, I am in good company because there are so many humanities subdisciplines, but also social studies subdisciplines, such as eco-criticism and eco-linguistics and environmental psychology and eco-media studies that provide for us as English educators wonderful material that we could work with and that in a way, also balance this seeming tension that has been mentioned earlier between sciences and the humanities by focusing on our strengths. That's why I think foreign language education must be thought within the context of the humanities, not at the exclusion of the sciences, but actually as an attempt to reinforce or strengthen what seems to have been forgotten in a couple of publications in past years. And then add one more. I also would like to strengthen the pedagogies of hope, as they are recently called. I see and I know from environmental psychology that the reinforcing of the catastrophe perspective, the so-called pedagogy of disaster, or that actually leaves students hopeless, destitute, depressed, despairing, and certainly also paralyzed. And the way to circumnavigate that is by reconsidering hope, providing them with examples that reassert agency. The problem is that this is at odds, and I'm trying to come to a close now, but I still want to finish that thought. This is somewhat at odds with another goal of language education, and that is the currentness. Right? We value very much in our teaching, in our education, to talk about current issues, to use current and so-called authentic material from the Anglophone, from the English-speaking world. But if you look at newspapers, of course, what sticks out are the catastrophes. And not necessarily the artistic representation of the environment. At least they are only represented in those publications or news outlets, some in some hidden corners, and you have to look for them. And that's why I think it's important to become more aware of this problem, avoid cynicism and apathy, and instead go and choose topics and examples and materials that provide more of a hopeful perspective. Hope matters, after all. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Thank you, Uwe. That was very effective, moving kind of speech, I think, or talk that you just made. And I really have to, support that idea of the importance of materials, the kind of materials that we work with students, and this concept of the pedagogies of hope. So thank you very much. Nick now will talk about section 2 of the book.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. And yeah, what Uwe says there, it reminded me of a Seamus Heaney phrase where he talks about the diamond absolutes. And one of the things that Uwe also asks about is, well, what is special about language teaching, additional language teaching in that way, and explores that really interestingly. And also, I would say that in his chapter, he provides some very interesting, illuminating examples of how he might approach environmental education within the second language or additional language classroom. And that, and Martin's point about critical listening, really leads me on to say a little bit about section 2. I think when you edit a book, in hindsight, you always think, oh, what might we have done differently? How might we have changed it? And reflecting on section 2 and calling it Thinking About Voice, 2 thoughts emerge. First of all, I wish we could have devoted more space in the book to this really important topic. It seems to me that it's a really developing field, looking at soundscapes, acoustic ecology, critical listening, which Martin's referred to earlier, embodiment and place. All those are important issues. Also, I wonder about the use of that word voice now. And that leads me into introducing the next chapter, which I'm immensely grateful for, from Tanya Gautam, because her work certainly introduced me to the riches of this academic field. And we're delighted, therefore, to include her chapter at this stage in it. And that chapter is followed by one from Linda Dunlop, a colleague at York, and Jelle de Schrijver from the University of Antwerp, 2 philosophers. And again, thinking of English as an additional language, we also wanted to include work from philosophers in the book under the umbrella of the language arts. Now, unfortunately, Linda and Jelle can't be with us, but they have given us some examples of the kind of philosophical questions they pose when working on environmental issues with their students. And later on, we will invite you, if you wish to have a go at some of those questions, at answering some of those questions. Incidentally, their chapter contains some fascinating transcript material about how they work with their students in philosophy to explore environmental issues.
Thank you, Nick. So, Tanya, we invite you to talk to your chapter.
Thank you so much. it's an honor to be included in this volume, and I'm really, really grateful to my professors, Roman Bartosz, Kate Rigby, my parents always, my mom's here, hi mom, and to Nicholas and Amanda for helping me find my way to this book and to the words. It takes a village to raise a writer and to be able to write a chapter. So, and also it takes another colleague to do what we've done in this chapter, which is, it talks about a workshop that I did in co-leadership with Katrin Klant, a colleague at the University of Cologne. And so when I got the request for the book, I had just finished this workshop with children of age 9 to 12, talking about biodiversity loss through poetry and through including these multimodal prompts of listening to sonic diversity through games, reading about the socio-ecological connections with other species across the world, and then also diving into the forms of poetry for them to write their own responses and craft their own worlds of meaning. So this is around, the chapter is around this workshop, but what is also very, very special to me is that I, as an Indian, writing and doing my doctoral research in English, doing a workshop in German with young kids. It was such an experience because I wrote poems for them in German and they wrote poems in German, which I had to translate in English. And so the ambiguity, the challenge, the creation, it was a phenomenal process. And so in this chapter, I also include lyric vignettes, like some instances of what I think are my vulnerability, not in the sense of a weakness, but a specific and shifting situatedness in this crisis, specifically speaking of loss. And so our practice was really about how do we speak of loss? How do students learn about loss, and how is it that we can express loss, which is not only taking place in this current time, but also of past and probable futures. And there I talk about two main ideas, but it's a patchwork where I'm just introducing these two ideas, beginning to cultivate these ideas of biodiversity loss, lyricism, and literacy, which is really to learn about the horizons and limitations of what it means to be human in times of loss, and to be prompted by the sonic and multimodal diversity of creation. And I draw on environmental humanities, and my lyric philosophy really is supported by ideas by Jan Zwicky and Kate Rigby, who's also written about creaturely ecopoetics and what it means to live and understand the entanglements of more than human vulnerability, especially in also a classroom setting where you're not just learning and passing to the next level, but you're also learning how to live and how that relates to our lyric expression and growth. So thank you so much again, and I'm just so grateful. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tanya. It's wonderful to have a poet as well as a researcher and a writer in the collection. And I must say, I think the issues that you deal with the children, with the youngsters in terms of extinction, it's so moving and it's so sad and it's so important, isn't it, to think, what do we do with that? How do we deal with that? So I don't know, Nick, if we want to say anything much, or just literally show Jelle and Linda's slides, because we're keeping the questions. So yeah, we've just got a few PowerPoint slides then, just to share with what Jelle and Linda work was about. And of course, they're philosophers and philosophy for children, and they looked at the use of philosophical dialogue in ecoliteracy education. So they just described then philosophical dialogue in terms of using questions, how we exchange ideas, and how we reflect and refine. And that's what Nick and I are hoping that perhaps you will do in the breakout rooms a little bit later on. So these are two questions that Jelle and Linda used with the youngsters. Are humans natural? And do we have to take care of the earth? And you'll see that these feature in the chapter. And again, this is what we're going to see if you'd like to have a go at. A little bit of philosophical dialogue later on. And of course, everybody's got the PowerPoint. I'll put the link to the PowerPoint in the chat to make sure that everybody's got access to this a little later on. But this is their contact details here. And indeed, everybody's contact details are on the PowerPoint, which I'll share with all the participants at the end of this digital presentation and before the breakouts. So now we're on to section 3. So again, Nick, you're going to do a little talk for us about section 3.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. As you can imagine, in a book about the language arts, texts feature pretty strongly in it. So reading and responding to text. When the national curriculum in England was suggested about 30, 40 years ago, people working across the arts tried to see if they could come together to develop some kind of matrix which the musicians, artists might all share when teaching children. And they came up with 3 concepts: making, performing, and responding to texts. So when you see responding there, again, what might be in there is performing texts. And in that context, we have 2 chapters. One from Molly Mullen and her team in Aotearoa, New Zealand, our second chapter from there, where they look at working through drama with young people, working through drama on the environment with young people. And then the chapter that Amanda and I will talk about is working with some older students, some trainee teachers on writing poetry themselves. And it was so nice for us as humanities people to have 3 chapters which look in some detail at poetry, from Sasha and Tanya and our own chapter. Molly can't be with us, unfortunately, so again, she's done a recording of her presentation, which we'll play for you. The first chapter in this section, I'm delighted that Jennifer MacDonald is here to share the fascinating work that she and Erin Spring have done on the concept of reading with, which Jennifer will explain to you. Then Hege Emma Rimmer-Rader and Ghazal Sheikh will talk about a fascinating international online exchange where students from Norway, Pakistan and the UK share their thoughts about the portrayal of the natural world in William Golding's novel Lord of the Flies. And Katarina Glass and Miguel Farias will then speak about their work on forest stewardship from a Chilean perspective. And that makes a fascinating counterpoint with Molly's chapter, which looks at forest stewardship in Aotearoa, New Zealand's context. Then Peter Sartoris is going to share his thoughts about the visual soup and visual literacy with us. And going nicely with, and welcome to Peter, who's here with us. And going nicely with that is a chapter from Billy McClune, Karen Kerr and Jennifer Roberts, talking about the environment, teaching the environment and social media. And again, that's a pre-recorded presentation. So if I may hand over to Jennifer now, please, Amanda, that'd be great.
Here we go. Jennifer.
Hello, thanks so much, everyone. And I'm joining you this early morning from Regina, Saskatchewan in Canada. And
Wow.
It's really wonderful to be here to share from our chapter. And thank you to Nicholas and Amanda for your leadership. It's been it felt like a really easy process. And to all the other contributors, I'm really enjoying hearing you speak about your chapters this morning. Unfortunately, Erin Spring, the co-author on the chapter, is unable to make it this morning. But just to say that we came to this chapter from very different angles. Erin is based in children's literature, and I come from the outdoor environmental education field, and where I work with Cree and Blackfoot and Tlingit elders and communities around educational initiatives. And we were really curious about in this chapter how about fictional worlds that we're bringing up young readers into, and how to invite and engage them into environmental issues. So the guiding questions were around how we can equip the readers to attend to real world the one that's burning and flooding and needing care, with the same fascination that they have with the fictional stories in classrooms. So how might we bring students into dialogue with local ecologies alive where they live? And how might we invite them to recognize the animacy of life-giving systems? So to address these questions, as Nick said, we bring forward this process of reading with to understand and engage place as an animate text. So we, in the Canadian context, we're drawing on the work of Cynthia Chambers, who writes that we need a language of our own, interpretive tools of our own, to live with the Canadian topography. And here we're very influenced by American and European texts, which are usually out of context from the nuances of place where we are. And we also draw heavily on Indigenous scholarship, mentors of mine, and we, in the chapter, talk about how non-Indigenous educators can ethically take up these teachings with care, where we prioritize the importance of place. And a Nehiho, a Cree friend of mine and mentor, articulates that the most urgent concern for education is to honor the unique animacy of places and to see them as living relatives. And he writes that the consistent acknowledgement of animacy of places is not just a neat idea, but it honors life and nurtures its continuance. So to honor animacy and the knowledge that flows from it, our premise in the chapter is that there are other ways to experience the natural world that is full of life and motion. And it's not about reading on or about place, but rather reading with the various ecological life forms that are already present. So reading with positions humans as part of the living web within unique patterns based on unique ecological insights, and engages in sensibilities to bring us into relationship with animacy. So in the chapter, we offer 4 possible practices that might help educators and learners promote or enhance reading within their context. These are being guided by local storytellers, critically questioning to foster relational identities, building language for attending to place relations, and participating in ecological kinetics and patterns. So through the chapter, the 2 main highlighted points is that partnerships are necessary, and these are cross-disciplinary partnerships, but also partnerships to build language across worldviews. And pedagogical possibilities are not exhaustive, but we hope that we might inspire others to attend to specific place-based insights alive where they are reading and engaging. So thank you very much for having me this morning, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think it's really powerful, this the work of being based in place and the web that within which we exist. And I think that is something, again, that recurs through the chapters. So now I'm going to invite Ghazal and Emma to talk to us about their work with Lord of the Flies and conceptions of nature and undergraduate students.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone. It has been wonderful listening to all of you. Me and Emma, we wrote a chapter about one of our projects that we are involved in with Amanda, Nick, Zoltan, and the 2 of us. We are part of a reading research group where we engage our undergraduate students from education and English in reading fiction and responding to it together, having a dialogue on a Google Doc. We basically started this thinking that fiction provides students a medium to speak about different issues, including citizenship, environment, and many others, as the themes of those texts were. This particular chapter is based on our 2 rounds of our data, in which we included, we had a different sentence. So students are involved in an in-class student-led literature circle discussion. They hold a circle where they are assigned roles. They talk to each other, and then they are in online transnational discussion with peers from other contexts. So Pakistani, Norwegian, and UK students talk to each other together on a Google Doc. In the first round, we gave them very general roles and prompts in the literature circles and Google groups, with no specific emphasis on any themes. The next round, we tried to give them more specific roles and prompts in the literature as well as Google circles, with one focusing on nature-related aspects of the novel. And Emma is going to tell you about the findings of the 2 rounds as well.
Thank you. The findings in the first round, we discovered that there was no discussion of any aspect of nature in relation to the novel Lord of the Flies. So we wanted to try and find out if the roles in class discussions and also the prompts had some focus on nature relevant aspects. And then nature was discussed explicitly when they were asked in their prompts. But even though there was a lack of ecosensitive and meta-language in the second round of data as well, we argue that the teacher's directions affect students' environmental education, because in the second round we also had some readings that they had to explore, which some of them brought into their discussions. So for recommendation for future work, we find that, not surprisingly, I suppose, is that the input from the teacher is crucial. You know, what the focus is when you go into a literary text. Students need guidance still in their reading of texts. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's really interesting, the fact that a number of times now we've had this idea of intercultural or transnational discussions, and this is obviously modelling something like that. So thank you very much. Right, now we come on to mine and Nick's chapter. So I'm just going to present the opening part of this, and then Nick will pick up on this a little later on. So our work was based on a project that was done with pre-service English teachers. And it was a collaboration between the English pre-service teachers and science-based pre-service teachers, because the students worked together and went on a field trip to the North Sea. We'll see here on the left. This is one of the beaches that the students went to on the coast of the North Sea. And the English students had to work with the science students collecting data for the field trip. So we can see on the right here the measuring instrument that all the students had to use to count the different organisms that were on the sea shore. So the English students had to undertake scientific field work, but beyond that, I asked the pre-service teachers then to collect their own data in terms of sensory data whilst they were on the field trip. And on return to the university, the students worked with a poet to pull together their sensory data and to write poems about the day and about the trip. On top of that, the students were then asked to craft these poems for a younger audience, for a young teenage audience. So the work that Nick and I then undertook was on the poetry written by the students, and we wanted to look at how they conceptualized the shoreline in their work, how they conceptualized pictures, and how they engaged with the non-human world, and they responded to the scientific work that they undertook. We wanted to probe their ideas about nature and their response to working in the field, perhaps a little bit like Jennifer's work, a kind of place-based work. So Nick, you wanted to talk about some of the theoretical elements that we picked out about the poems.
Well, just very briefly, Amanda, but two things just wanted to pick out. You can read for yourselves the quotations there that we've got at the bottom. The first one was the idea, again, of reaching out against the binaries of arts against sciences, but working productively with science colleagues on this. The picture of the quadrat, I think it was called, Amanda, yeah?
Yeah.
Mind this use of this scientific instrument to help the students focus their work. Reminded me of an essay by Vygotsky where he talks about the relationship between a child and a stick, and the child thinks of the stick as a horse, and once they've made that metaphorical leap, the stick then opens up all sorts of possibilities of imaginative thinking. And it was striking to see how the students who used that quadrat really started to think in interesting ways about the landscape and the beach and the creatures they were finding there. We were disappointed, I think, by the students' reluctance, shall we say, to engage with science in their writing, and also, as literature graduates, the way they conceived of the natural world in such an anthropocentric manner, drawing upon tropes from classical literature and their own reading to conceptualize the natural world. So those are two very interesting points which you took away from that.
Thank you, Nick. So we'll move on.
Kia ora koutou katoa. My name is Molly Mullen, and I'm speaking on behalf of all the co-authors of this chapter. We were all part of a team that ran a project called Toitu Te Ngāhere. This was a participatory arts-based research project involving primary schools in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. The project focused on raising awareness of two plant pathogens that threatened native tree species, well, still threaten native tree species in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Toitu Te Ngāhere sought to involve children as more equal participants in biosecurity, communication and action, recognising that they were mostly recipients of biosecurity messages that had been decided on by other people. For example, wash your footwear before walking in a kauri forest. Toitu Te Ngāhere involved primary school children and their teachers, working with experts from the university, from iwi or tribes, and from their communities, to develop and undertake inquiry projects into their local forest health issues. They then created artworks that would inform and engage their communities about and with those issues. The children chose to work with lots of different art forms, but in this chapter, our focus is drama and storytelling, and we give examples of projects from 3 of our partner schools. We conclude that interweaving drama and storytelling with Mātauranga Māori, so Māori knowledge, and Western science as part of a shared inquiry can enable children to explore and express their relationships to Ngāhere, forests, and support them into serious but playful and culturally attuned forms of creative eco-citizenship. I hope you enjoy reading the chapter. Ka kite.
Ka kite. So, Katerina, we invite you to take the floor with your talk.
Thank you very much. Good morning from Chile. And I'm very honored to have been invited to the project, and very, very happy also to introduce Miguel Farias to this whole group here, who very kindly piloted the materials with me about socio-environmental injustice in forest stewardship. This is about a multi-perspective materials assemblage, and Miguel's group in USACH, Universidad de Santiago de Chile, reacted to these materials, and we had the opportunity to analyze them for the chapter. So what this is really about, it's very multimodal, so I'm afraid I've got more slides than probably anybody else today. But this is about getting students to think and wonder about disposable wood and paper products that were produced or that are produced in conditions that, maybe if you move on, Amanda, to the next slide, please. Especially in the south of Chile, where there's big socio-environmental conflicts about forestry plantations that have gradually replaced healthy forests. So apparently, according to Uwe Küchler, I'm thinking about forests all the time because I'm German, but based in Chile for a long time already. So the idea was to juxtapose images and texts, also including from indigenous authors from Chile, but also from other countries, to get this vision about what's happening with the world of the forests, but also monocultural forest plantations that are threatening the biodiversity in the south of Chile, especially. So the idea is to get EFL learners to think critically and discover shared responsibilities in malfunctioning forest stewardship, explore alternatives to single-use products made of wood and paper. And if you move on, Amanda, please. Develop some competencies for sustainability. So we've also included a few reflections on the UNESCO framework on education for sustainable development goals. And the next slide, please. We've for that, we've developed a web quest, which invites students to do some detective work on this socio-environmental conflict. And you can actually access the web quest on this URL that you can see on the slide, independently from the chapter. But obviously, the chapter gives you much more insight about the background of the material's development, and also the reactions that our student teachers here in Chile had to this. So we're looking forward to having an international readership for the chapter, but also getting reactions from different parts of the world, because it's clearly not only about Chile, it's a lot more than that. And here we are closing with this quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who also inspired our work very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katharina. I think that web quest will be a fantastic thing for students anywhere across the world to do, and I'll certainly be trying to get my students to do it.
Yeah,
Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. It's great to be here. Thank you. And yeah, so many interesting chapters. I haven't had a chance to read the book in full yet, so it's great to just hear all these perspectives. And I suppose where my chapter fits in is with the theme of hope, among other things that many of the others have already talked about. And I come at this theme of hope through conversations around visual literacy. So the chapter is an attempt to bridge some of the conversations that people have been having over the years about the importance of visual literacy, not just as a tool, but really as an integral part of education. And I make this argument, which is not much of an argument. It's really just a sort of self-evident observation that we live in a visual soup, that we are surrounded by images, that images are everywhere, and many of them are supposedly neutral. We don't often think about the kind of images that we use in teaching, the kind of images that we expose our students to. These days, many images are AI generated. We don't even have sort of active agency sometimes in curating our images and choosing what we are exposing our students to. And when we look at the kinds of images that often are used in environmental and sustainability education, they tend to be used for shock value. They also tend to be used for sort of being quite didactic, telling young people how they should behave, the kinds of things they should do or shouldn't do. And I think there's also a fair bit of fatalism and not much space for agency in the kinds of images that we use, and I try to illustrate that with some examples in the chapter. And what I argue is that what we need instead is images that connect to young people emotionally, and which are ambiguous, which make it possible for the viewers to arrive at their own conclusions, sort of visual puzzles almost, you could say, and the kinds of images that that basically open up conversations rather than just make statements. And so I think this idea of reading an image, reflecting on an image, how do we do that? How does that lead to different kinds of conversations from the ones that we've been having is very important. And in the chapter, I also reflect on some of my own experiences of using visual methods in actually creating images with young people, both in research and in teaching. And I reflect on what you can learn from the process of creating an image, about how to read an image, reflect on an image, have a conversation about an image. The participation in the process of creation itself becomes something that enhances visual literacy. And so at the end of the chapter, I basically come to this conclusion, sort of unsurprisingly, kind of circling back to the original point, that visual literacy is a really key element of environmental sustainability education, and that it is also something that is very much neglected, and that I think we as educators would do well to pay attention to. And obviously, I only just scratched the surface in this chapter by providing a few quick examples, but to my mind, this really is something that sort of calls for a book of its own in a way. Maybe somebody will have the bandwidth to take that on. If you do, that would be amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. That's really interesting. I particularly like the way that your chapter picks up on so many of them about participation and creation being so significant in engaging students, and of course we do live in a visual soup, but we do need to work and train and help students to live in that. So this is a critical moment here. I've got a link in which a link to open, and then we've got a recording from Billy and Karen. So hopefully this will work.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this whistle-stop tour of chapter 13. My name is Karen, and I am one of 3 authors on this chapter, where we talk about engaging young people with eco-critical analysis of language in the. We start our chapter with a headline from the media entitled "Speeding Towards Catastrophe," and that is purposeful because it's within this introductory section that we talk about the rationale for our chapter, which centres around current planetary crises. Then we move on to discuss how we can develop ecoliteracy and how that is dependent on accepting a cross-disciplinary approach across subjects that would traditionally be taught by themselves. Then we move on to discuss traditional media versus modern media and what we take that to be in the current age. From there, we consider earlier work by Billy, another author on the chapter, and we move the framework from scientific literacy to critical ecoliteracy. Following that then, we present some core ideas which link theory with research-led practice. Ideas such as use of text for critical reading, for examining and evaluating text, and provoking reader response as well, and how important that is to develop ecoliteracy. Then we move on to talk about social media, and we give some ideas there from practice which we have used in the past, to include the use of hashtags, pictures, and how they can provoke responses as well, and looking at advertisements, for example. And finally, we bring the chapter to a conclusion by talking about some of the very practical ways that we have used the theory in our research-led practice, to include a Newswise project, what myself and Jennifer have done within initial teacher education across different subjects here in Queen's University, and also work around youth voices and social media and how that would direct a lot of the future work within critical ecoliteracy. And the final image there is our hopeful response that we will move from speeding towards catastrophe by working with our young people to a much healthier planet moving forward. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the event. Hello everyone and welcome to this whistle stop tour of chapter 13. My name is Hello everyone and welcome to this whistle stop tour.
All right, I'm trying to move on to the next. I'm going to stop sharing and bring the PowerPoint back. Okay, so now I managed to stop the panopto coming around. So we're going to go to our conclusion. Now, Nick and I were really very cheeky in asking our very great colleague, Ian Davis. He's very well known to Nick and I. We worked with him for a long time. And he's emeritus professor at the University of York. And we thought that who better than Ian to provide a conclusion. So I hand over to you, Ian, to talk about your conclusion to the book that you so kindly did for us.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks very much for the opportunity to contribute. For me, a real privilege, a great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Now, in the conclusion, I don't repeat the significant achievements of the authors. Rather, what I do in the conclusion is reflect on their ideas, use them as a springboard for an ongoing discussion. And what I'm briefly going to draw attention to is in 3 sections. I'll say something about context, I'll say something about an overarching educational framework, and I'll say something about possible actions. So first, context. Now, the environment's clearly in crisis. There's no doubt about that. And reassuringly, encouragingly, there's a lot of useful things happening. There are calls for action. There is action. We can be positive. However, there is also very obviously neglect. Very obviously and very disappointingly, there's opposition, perhaps more so very recently than has been the case a little while ago. Opposition to the idea of caring for the environment. And crucially, even when there is the necessary concern for the environment, there is a lack of consensus. So what do we do about things? It's very, very difficult. And sometimes those differences emerge from different political perspectives, sometimes to do with academic and legal and philosophical debates, but there are differences. So there's a crisis, and there's a crisis beyond the crisis. Now, in trying to understand what the environment is, and to try and get a handle on some of the issues and ideas about it, I thought it would be quite useful to take a metaphorical approach. I thought that would fit with the idea of a book on the language arts, but I also thought in itself it might be quite interesting and useful. And I've just picked 4 metaphors about the environment, something that would help us to say, well, what is it that we're dealing with? How do we look at the environment? And the first one is paradise. It's just a thing of joy and wonder. And you can see that very obviously in many religious traditions, but in other ways too, a sense of paradise. A second metaphor, which I thought would be useful to identify some of the perspectives on the environment, was to use Blake's phrase, a fearful symmetry. The environment is something that is actually wonderful, but terrifying, horrifying. And there are many examples of plays and prose and poems that are all about that sense of fear. The third metaphor, which I used, was one of the inexhaustible gift, that the environment is actually there for extractive industries to never-endingly withdraw whatever they want, and then, with the waste materials, to endlessly dump. The inexhaustible gift. But the fourth and final metaphor, which I referred to, was a quote from Torres, who talked about real utopias. And I think most of the authors in the book are essentially focusing their attention on real utopias. How to gain something that's wonderful, how to benefit and be with something that is wonderful in a very realistic way, and how as educators we might facilitate that process of bringing the wonderful into being. Now, those metaphors in some ways connect with political ideologies about the environment, how we understand it, how we approach it. And perhaps the first and most obvious one of those political ideologies that is interesting to talk about is colonization. The idea of extracting endlessly, gaining power over the environment. And perhaps, and many writers have talked about this is something that has been particularly apparent since the Industrial Revolution, obviously the growth of empires and so on, that really people will dominate. Now, another perspective to do a political ideology to do with the environment might be to do with rights. What rights do we have in relation to the environment? But also, interestingly, what sort of rights might the environment itself have? And there have been some very interesting developments, particularly legal developments in relation to this, so that now Lake Erie has rights. And there are big debates about whether it's appropriate for the environment and for animals to have rights, or whether they should have rights which are the same as humans or different from humans, or whether the idea itself is that rights are just completely inappropriate and maybe we have responsibility for the environment, but the idea of the environment itself having rights is problematic. There's a big debate there. A third political ideology or philosophical perspective that can be brought to bear on the environment is utilitarianism, and whether or not we can take that key idea of utilitarians, of getting the greatest happiness for the greatest number, is that the way we should approach things? Should we take what we can that's sensible for the majority, or is that not quite the way we wish to proceed? And the final political and philosophical perspective is a sort of neo-Aristotelian virtue, doing the right thing. And I think we all want to do the right thing. Knowing what that thing is and what the processes are whereby we might achieve it, a very different matter altogether. So, the context, we've got a crisis, we've got to think about what the environment is, and we've got to think about how we interact with the environment, what sort of political perspective we have on it. What then for an overarching educational framework, the second part of what I'd like to say. And I think here a lot of the authors, and I would agree with this, seem to be moving beyond the idea of there being a clear and simple and straightforward answer. You simply tell students what to do and they do it, and tell students what's important and they accept it. And you'd move beyond content, simply telling people to remember things. You'd even move beyond skills, showing them how to do certain things. I think what we might find useful, what I think would be useful as an overarching educational framework, would be to have a conceptual approach. And in promoting a conceptual approach, I think we should be aware that there are different sorts of concepts, substantive and procedural. Now, the substantive is fundamentally what we learn about, and the procedural is how we learn. And I think if we have both those sorts of concepts outlined, there's a chance for some useful, valuable education about the environment. But that puts the pressure on us, because we then have to say, well, what would those concepts be? Now, just as an initial attempt to identify what those substantive concepts might be, what we learn about, I think we should look at place, where we live. We should look at socially just ideas and practices, how we live. And we should look at identity, who we are. So if we were to say, well, what should we learn about conceptually, substantively? It should be place, socially just ideas and practices, and identity, where we are, how we live, and who we are. In terms of the procedural concepts, or how we learn, again, as an initial attempt to try and say what could be important, I think there should be something about understanding. I think there should be something about critiquing. And I think there should be something about engaging about, in, and through the environment. So if we're understanding, that's an approach to rationality, and that could be done individually, it could be done with others. But critiquing, again, could be done individually, but it's about voice and advocacy. And engaging is about acting and reflecting. So I'm proposing an overarching educational framework that's conceptually based, substantively and procedurally. The final thing that I'll say is to do with actions. What could we do? Well, I'd like to highlight pedagogy. I think we should continue to work, and the good work that's been done in this book, on clarifying the centrality of education in learning about, through, and for the environment. Now, in emphasizing, because I've just done that word for the environment, I think pedagogy in this area, the teaching and learning in this area is very challenging, because our job, I think, principally as educators, is to educate, obviously. But that education means engagement. And there arises the interesting issue of the interplay between education and activism. And I think it's inappropriate not to engage. I think it's inappropriate to engage in a way that's narrowly defined for a particular political objective. That boundary line between education and activism, I think, is a very challenging one, but a very necessary one for us to explore. The business of what sort of pedagogy we want, I think we could clarify that even more. I think we could do more on assessment and evaluation. And by that I mean we need to keep working about what students learn and how they learn it, what's effective and what's not effective. And so in emphasizing assessment, I'm not making a point about testing. I mean, testing might have its limited place where students go into closed exams and then they do various tasks and etc., etc. But I'm talking about the sort of assessment which happens every moment of an educational interchange, where the teacher is working with the students and always asking, now, what are they learning? What are they understanding? How am I doing? Am I really educating here? That sort of assessment gives us a completely different perspective on what is usually, when people say assessment, they usually mean testing, and that's not what I mean. An evaluation, well, what is really happening here? How can we look at it? And I don't mean plugging into the rather limited zone of what works. I'm talking about a much more in-depth, valuable, professional, reflective sense of how things are working out. And the last thing I'll say is something of an action that I think is very important indeed. It's about generating general support for what we're doing. Are policymakers taking any notice? Are NGOs taking any notice? Are parents taking any notice? Are people on board with this? And by saying that, I'm trying to emphasize that we need to be politically effective in ourselves. Of course, we need to be good professionals. Of course, we need to be good community-based practitioners. Of course, we need to be good academics. And of course, we need to be politically effective. And rationality is not enough. We need that persuasiveness that comes with a political approach to educational issues. So that's my conclusion, emphasizing the context, an educational framework and actions. And I hope that's done some, that's taken with the very positive intention of recognizing the very valuable work that's been done in this very good book indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's really good the way that you with your kind of historical perhaps perspective, taking a step back and drawing out those really key themes. And I think what's come through a lot today is the boundary between education and activism, and where or how can we or should we how far does education move in towards activism, but also we need to be political effective. I completely agree with that. And we hope that this book does contribute in some ways towards pedagogy, so actions on pedagogy. And when I was listening to what you said about assessment, it struck me that it really seemed to be about dialogue. What we were saying is dialogue between teachers and students. What have they learned? How have they learned? And how do we get into working together on that? So we really appreciate this, the refined approach that you've taken.